It is basically his room and my room, so we spent a lot of time together up there because there wasn't anything else going on. And that's when I got to really, be with him.
The Memphis Mafia were always with Elvis Presley. They were his personal bodyguards. Before her own passing, his daughter, Lisa Marie, finally spoke about events leading up to his death. And what she said about the men surrounding her father was shocking. Did the Memphis Mafia protect Elvis, or did they destroy him? Was his death truly an accident? Surrounded but still alone. Elvis Presley never walked into a room by himself. There was always someone beside him, behind him, ahead of him. A wall of familiar faces moving in perfect formation wherever he went. They called themselves the Memphis Mafia, a tight group of men who had attached themselves to Elvis's world and never let go. They dressed like him, traveled with him, ate with him, and filled every room he occupied with noise and energy and laughter. On the surface, it looked like brotherhood, the kind of closeness most people spend their whole lives searching for. Elvis had it in abundance, or at least that was how it appeared. The matching outfits, the inside jokes, the constant presence, all of it painted a picture of a man who was deeply loved and fiercely protected. Yet, underneath that picture, something far more unsettling was quietly taking shape. The men around Elvis weren't just friends enjoying the ride. They were fixtures in a world that revolved entirely around one man's comfort, one man's whims, and one man's money. Keeping Elvis happy wasn't just a priority, it was a full-time occupation. And keeping him happy meant never telling him things he didn't want to hear. That distinction matters enormously. A true friend tells the truth even when it hurts, steps in even when it's uncomfortable, and puts the other person's well-being above the warmth and security of the relationship itself. What surrounded Elvis increasingly failed that test. The people in his circle said yes when they should have said no, stayed quiet when they should have spoken up, and smiled through situations that deserved serious concern. Elvis was a man of extraordinary warmth and generosity, someone who gave freely and loved deeply. Yet that same open heart made him vulnerable in ways he couldn't fully see. He trusted the people around him completely, and that trust, so genuine and so total, became one of the most dangerous things about his situation. He was never alone in any room, yet in the ways that truly mattered, Elvis Presley was profoundly, heartbreakingly isolated. The person who perhaps saw this most clearly wasn't one of the men in those matching suits. It was a little girl growing up inside the walls of Graceland, watching everything with wide, quiet eyes. What did Lisa Marie Presley see that the rest of the world missed? A child watching everything. Graceland was unlike any other childhood home in the world. It sat behind iron gates on Elvis Presley Lane in Memphis, Tennessee, grand and sprawling, filled with the kind of excess that most people only ever see in movies. There were rooms decorated in bold, unusual styles. A jungle room with its own waterfall, horses in the paddock out back, and a constant parade of visitors, staff, and associates moving through the property at all hours. For any child, it would have been an overwhelming place to grow up. For Lisa Marie Presley, it was simply home. She was born on February 1st, 1968, the only child of Elvis and Priscilla Presley, and from her very first days, she existed at the center of a world unlike anything most people could imagine. Elvis adored her with a completeness that those around him described as one of the purest things they ever witnessed. She was his daughter, his joy, the one relationship in his life that came with no complications, no agenda, and no performance required. When Lisa Marie was in the room, Elvis softened in a way that nothing else could produce. Yet, the stability that every child needs was quietly slipping away beneath the surface of that grand life. When Lisa Marie was 4 years old, Elvis and Priscilla separated, and by 1973, their divorce was finalized. The family that had seemed so golden from the outside had come apart, and a little girl was left navigating two very different worlds. Her mother's structured and grounded, her father's wild and unpredictable. Her time at Graceland continued, spent in visits that were filled with love, yet shadowed by everything that came with Elvis's increasingly chaotic world. The men of the Memphis Mafia were always there, loud and present, filling the halls with energy that felt exciting on the surface, yet carried an undercurrent that a perceptive child could feel without being able to name. Lisa Marie was perceptive. She watched, she absorbed, and she remembered with the kind of clarity that stays with a person for the rest of their life. She loved her father completely, yet love doesn't make a child blind, and what she witnessed inside those walls left marks that would take decades to fully surface. She was 9 years old when the world she knew collapsed entirely. The things she had already seen by then were things no child should ever have to carry. What was really happening inside Graceland behind all that laughter and noise? Fear behind closed doors. The men of the Memphis Mafia kept things lively, filling Graceland with an energy that never seemed to settle or quiet down. For a visiting child, it might have looked like one long, extraordinary party. For Lisa Marie Presley, living inside it day after day, it felt like something else entirely. The Memphis Mafia had a presence that was difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. These were large, confident men who operated by their own rules, answering to Elvis and essentially to no one else. There was no structure in the traditional sense, no bedtimes enforced, no boundaries firmly drawn, no quiet authority stepping in to create the kind of safe, predictable environment that children need to feel secure. What existed instead was a kind of organized chaos, held together entirely by Elvis's personality and the unspoken agreement that whatever Elvis wanted, Elvis received. For Lisa Marie, some of the men in that circle were unsettling in ways she struggled to articulate. Even as an adult looking back, the unease wasn't always tied to a specific incident or a single moment she could point to clearly. It was atmospheric, a feeling that lived in the walls of certain rooms and in the dynamic between the men who filled them. She has spoken about feeling uncomfortable, about sensing that the environment around her father was not one built on genuine care or healthy boundaries, and that the laughter masking it all made it harder, not easier, to see clearly. There were no rules at Graceland in any conventional sense. Discipline was not a word that applied to the world Elvis had built around himself, and while the freedom could feel exhilarating, it created a vacuum where accountability should have lived. A mansion full of people, yet nobody truly in charge of making sure things were safe, stable, or sustainable. Elvis himself was the warmth at the center of all of it. Genuinely loving, genuinely present when he was well. Yet, even his enormous personality couldn't fully compensate for the dysfunction surrounding it. The people meant to support him were instead enabling a world that was slowly, quietly spinning out of control. Lisa Marie saw it, felt it, and carried it. The laughter in those halls was real, yet so was the darkness running beneath it. What exactly was happening inside Graceland that a young girl was left to witness on her own? The law no one stopped. There is a particular kind of danger that hides inside abundance. It doesn't look like danger at first glance, it looks like freedom, like fun, like a life without limits, and for a while, it can be genuinely difficult to separate the two. Inside Graceland during the 1970s, that line had not just been blurred, it had been erased entirely, and the consequences were becoming impossible to ignore for anyone paying close enough attention. The Memphis Mafia operated in a world where saying no to Elvis was simply not part of the arrangement. Whatever Elvis wanted found its way to him, whether that was food at 3 in the morning, a new car on a whim, or the prescription medications that had begun to occupy a more and more central role in his daily life. The men around him had long since stopped functioning as a genuine support system and had settled instead into something far more passive, a group of enablers who mistook indulgence for loyalty and called it devotion. Drugs were present in Elvis's world in a way that was no longer occasional or hidden. Prescription pills had become woven into the fabric of his routine, managed and supplied through a medical arrangement that those close to him found deeply troubling, yet few were willing to confront directly. The doctor at the center of that arrangement kept Elvis medicated in ways that served Elvis's immediate desires, without regard for the longer-term damage being done. The men around Elvis watched this unfold, and largely said nothing, because saying something meant risking everything: their access, their salaries, their place inside the most exciting world any of them had ever known. Alongside the medication came an environment that offered very little in the way of grounding or restraint. Parties filled Graceland regularly, the strangers moved through the property with ease, and the atmosphere inside those walls bore almost no resemblance to anything that could be described as stable or healthy. Explicit magazines circulated openly. The boundaries that normally exist in a functioning household were absent, replaced by a permissiveness that served the mood of the moment rather than the well-being of anyone living inside it. Lisa Marie Presley witnessed all of this. She was a child moving through an adult world that had never been designed with her presence in mind, absorbing images and experiences that left impressions far too heavy for young shoulders to carry. She loved her father with everything she had, yet even through the lens of that love, she could see that the people surrounding him were not protecting him. They were participating in his unraveling, one quiet yes at a time, one missed intervention at a time, one ignored warning sign at a time. She has said in her own words that she believed the people around her father didn't protect him. They encouraged the very things that were destroying him, and they did it with smiles on their faces and loyalty on their lips. The damage being done inside those walls was already deep, yet Elvis himself was beginning to show it in ways the whole world could see. How far had the king already fallen, and what was the cost of everyone's silence? The king begins to fall. There was a time when Elvis Presley walked onto a stage and the air in the room changed. It wasn't something that could be manufactured or rehearsed. It was simply what happened when he arrived. A shift in atmosphere so complete and so immediate that audiences felt it before he sang a single note. He had possessed that quality since the very beginning, a presence so magnetic and so overwhelming that it seemed to belong to someone larger than an ordinary human life could contain. By the mid-1970s, that presence was still there, still capable of filling an arena and silencing every other thought in the room. Yet something beneath it had begun to fracture in ways that were becoming harder to conceal. Elvis was not well, and the evidence was mounting in plain sight for anyone willing to look directly at it rather than past it. His weight had changed significantly, fluctuating in ways that reflected the chaos his body was enduring from years of prescription, medications dependency, irregular sleep, poor nutrition, and the relentless physical demands of constant touring. The jumpsuits that had once draped a lean, electrifying performer were now being adjusted and redesigned to accommodate a body that was struggling in ways nobody around him seemed willing to address openly. The addiction had tightened its grip in ways that went far beyond what had been true even a few years earlier. Elvis was consuming combinations of prescription medications that left him disoriented, forgetful, and physically unsteady in ways that sometimes showed up on stage. There were performances during this period where he slurred his words, lost his place in a song, or moved through a set with an energy that was visibly diminished from the standard he had always set for himself. For a man who had built his entire identity around performance, those moments carried a particular kind of pain. The isolation that had always lurked beneath the surface of his crowded life was deepening too. Elvis had spent years surrounded by people, yet increasingly cut off from genuine connection, from honest conversation, from the kind of relationship where someone sits across from you and tells you the truth because they love you enough to risk your anger. The Memphis Mafia had long since stopped being that for him, and the gap left by their silence was growing wider with every passing month. His spirit, that extraordinary luminous quality that had made the world fall in love with him, was weakening under the weight of everything he was carrying alone. Fame had given him everything and protected him from nothing, and the higher his legend had climbed, the more completely it had sealed him inside a life that was slowly suffocating him. The people who should have reached in and pulled him back were still standing in the room, still drawing their salaries, still calling themselves loyal. Yet loyalty without honesty is simply comfort wearing a disguise, and Elvis Presley was paying the highest possible price for the comfort of the people around him. Something had to give, and when it did, it came not from the outside world, but from inside the circle itself. What happened when the money ran out and the loyalty that had always looked so solid began to crack? Money runs out, loyalty fades. For years, the Memphis Mafia had operated as though the resources fueling their world were simply inexhaustible. Elvis earned extraordinary sums throughout his career, yet the financial architecture of his life had never been built with long-term security as its foundation. Colonel Tom Parker, his famously controlling manager, took a commission that many considered excessive even by the standards of the era, and the sheer cost of maintaining Elvis's lifestyle, the staff, the properties, the travel, the entourages, the endless generosity Elvis showed to almost everyone around him had been quietly eating through his fortune for years. By the mid-1970s, Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, who managed the financial side of his son's affairs, was facing a reality that could no longer be deferred or softened. The money was not infinite, the expenses were enormous, and something had to be done. The decision that followed was painful in the particular way that only decisions involving people rather than numbers can be. Members of the Memphis Mafia were let go. For men who had built their entire identities around their proximity to Elvis, who had structured their lives, their relationships, and their sense of self around their place inside his world, being fired was not simply a professional setback, It was something closer to an identity crisis, a sudden and brutal severing from the only life many of them had known for years. They had given Elvis their time, their presence, and in their own minds, their loyalty, and now they were being handed their walking papers by a man with a ledger rather than a relationship. The atmosphere inside what remained of the inner circle shifted noticeably. The easy, unquestioned confidence that had always characterized the Memphis Mafia gave way to something more guarded, more uncertain, and in some cases, more resentful. The men who remained did so with the knowledge that their position was no longer guaranteed, and the men who had been let go carried something with them that would eventually find its way into the open in the most damaging way possible. What the dismissals revealed, more clearly than anything else, was the transactional nature of much of what had passed for loyalty inside Elvis's world. Genuine devotion doesn't evaporate when a salary disappears. It doesn't turn into grievance when circumstances change, and it certainly doesn't go looking for an outlet that places the feelings of the wounded party above the dignity and privacy of the person they once claimed to love. Yet that is precisely what happened. The cracks that had always existed beneath the polished surface of the Memphis Mafia's brotherhood were now splitting wide open, and the consequences were about to become very public and very damaging. Elvis was already carrying more than any one person should have to bear, and the people he had trusted most were about to add something new to that weight. What did two of his closest and most trusted companions do with their anger, and what did it cost the man they claimed had been their brother? The ultimate betrayal. Among all the men who had ever worn the Memphis Mafia name with pride, Red West and Sonny West stood closest to the center. Red had known Elvis since their school days in Memphis, a friendship that predated the fame, the money, and everything that came with it. Sonny, Red's cousin, had followed that path into Elvis's world and made it his own. These were not simply employees or hangers-on. They were men Elvis had trusted the way most people trust family, with the unguarded, unconditional openness that only comes when you believe the person across from you would never use what they know against you. When Vernon Presley made the decision to let them go in 1976, the dismissal landed hard. Red and Sonny had given years of their lives to Elvis's world, and being shown the door felt to them like a profound injustice. The resentment that followed was real and understandable in its human dimension, even if what they chose to do with it was not. Together with the writer Dave Hebler, Red and Sonny began working on a book, not a celebration of their years alongside one of the most iconic figures in music history, not a tribute to a friendship that had spanned decades, but a tell-all account filled with private details, unflattering stories, and intimate revelations about Elvis's life behind closed doors. The book was called Elvis: What Happened, and it was exactly what the title suggested, a public unraveling of the private man, written by people who had been given access to his most unguarded moments precisely because he had trusted them completely. They framed the project publicly as an act of concern, a last desperate attempt to force Elvis to confront the reality of his addiction and the damage it was doing. They claimed they had tried everything else, and that this was the only remaining option, that exposing him was somehow the same as saving him. It was a justification that required a significant willingness to overlook the obvious, that a person genuinely trying to help someone they love does not monetize that help, does not sell it to a publisher, and does not time its release for maximum commercial impact. Lisa Marie Presley did not accept that framing, not as a child absorbing the aftermath, and certainly not as an adult reflecting on what it had meant. Her view was direct and unsparing. These men had not tried to save her father. They had contributed to the conditions that made saving him nearly impossible, and when the relationship no longer served them, they had taken everything they knew and turned it into a weapon. The book was published in August of 1977. Elvis knew it was coming, had known for some time that the people he had once called brothers were putting his private life on public display, and the knowledge of it had settled over him like something he couldn't lift. The damage it did went far beyond embarrassment. What did it really cost Elvis in those final weeks? And how much did Lisa Marie believe this betrayal contributed to what happened next? The book that broke him. There are wounds that leave no visible mark, ones that don't show up in any medical report or physical examination, yet cut deeper than almost anything a body can experience. The kind that comes not from a stranger or an enemy, but from someone you loved without reservation. Someone you let into the most private corners of your life because you believed, completely and without question, that they would treat what they found there with care. For Elvis Presley, the publication of Elvis: What Happened was that kind of wound. He had known it was coming. Word had reached him well before the book hit shelves in August of 1977, and the weeks leading up to its release had been some of the heaviest of his life. Knowing didn't soften it. If anything, the waiting made it worse, giving him time to sit with the reality of what Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler had done, turning years of shared history, private moments, and deeply personal struggles into a product available for anyone to purchase and consume. The book did not hold back. It detailed Elvis's prescription drug dependency with the kind of intimacy that could only come from people who had watched it up close, people who had been in the room, people he had never thought to hide from because he had trusted them with everything. Private stories, personal vulnerabilities, moments that belonged to the quiet interior of a life rather than its public surface. All of it laid out for the world to read. Elvis was devastated. Those close to him during those final weeks described a man carrying a weight that had grown too heavy, someone who had absorbed one blow too many, and no longer had the reserves to recover the way he once might have. The betrayal wasn't simply painful, it was destabilizing, arriving at a moment when he was already deeply fragile, and had very little left in the way of emotional defense. Lisa Marie Presley has spoken about this period with a clarity and a grief that makes the reality of it impossible to dismiss. She believed the book broke something in her father that was already close to breaking, that the public exposure of his most private pain by the people he had trusted most accelerated a decline that might otherwise have moved more slowly. He had survived so much, yet this, coming from inside the circle, from the hands of men he had called brothers, was something he could not find his way through. The end was closer than anyone wanted to believe, and August 16th was only days away. What did Elvis's final hours look like, and what was Lisa Marie left to carry when the world she knew disappeared overnight? The final days of a legend. August 16th, 1977 began at Graceland the way most days did, quietly, heavily, with the particular stillness that had come to define Elvis's world in those final months. He had just come off a tour and was preparing to head back out again, his body exhausted, his spirit worn thin by everything it had been asked to carry for far too long. He hadn't slept well. The medications that had become so central to his daily existence were no longer delivering the rest they once promised, and the emotional weight of the book's publication sat over everything like a shadow that wouldn't lift. Those who saw him in those final days described a man who seemed distant, heavier in spirit than in body, moving through his hours with a quietness that felt different from peace. In the early hours of that morning, Elvis spent time with Ginger Alden, reading and talking in the dim quiet of Graceland. At some point he moved to the bathroom, book in hand, telling Ginger he would return shortly. He never did. When Ginger found him unresponsive on the floor hours later, the frantic rush that followed couldn't change what had already happened. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Elvis Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. He was 42 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrhythmia, though those who had watched his final months understood that the story was far more layered than any single medical term could capture. Years of addiction, physical decline, emotional devastation, and a loneliness that had grown too large to survive had all played their part. Lisa Marie lost her father that day, yet what followed his death would bring its own separate and painful reckoning. How did a daughter carry that grief? And what did she feel when the world began telling her father's story without her? A daughter's pain and a legacy questioned Elvis Presley's death on August 16, 1977. Silenced the world for a moment, then immediately filled it with noise. Tributes poured in from every direction, news programs ran continuous coverage, and fans gathered outside Graceland in their thousands, united in a grief that was entirely genuine. The king was gone, and the world wanted to talk about it endlessly. For Lisa Marie Presley, 9 years old and suddenly fatherless, the noise was overwhelming. She had lost the man who had looked at her like she was the most important thing in any room. And before she had any chance to process that loss privately, the public machinery of Elvis's legend had already begun reframing and reshaping the story of his life and death for mass consumption. What followed in the years and decades after his passing deepened her pain in ways that went beyond ordinary grief. Books, interviews, television programs, and documentaries picked through the details of her father's final years with a relentlessness that felt, to Lisa Marie, like a second violation. The same people who had failed Elvis in life were now profiting from his death, offering themselves as authorities on a man whose private suffering they had either enabled or exploited. The show titled The Last Days of Elvis brought those feelings to the surface with particular force. Lisa Marie felt that her father's dignity was being dismantled piece by piece, his struggles displayed without the compassion or context they deserved, his name attached to a narrative that served everyone except the man himself. She eventually channeled that grief and fury into music, releasing a song called Nobody Noticed, a haunting and deeply personal piece that asked the question she had carried since childhood. Everyone was there, surrounding her father at every moment, filling every room he occupied, yet nobody truly saw what was happening. Nobody reached in, nobody stopped it. Was Elvis Presley betrayed by the people he trusted most? Or was he a man too powerful and too broken to be saved?